So I am going to throw things over now to our moderator for tonight, Sophia Prater, who is the founder of Rewired UX and object-oriented UX guru, who has assembled this stellar panel, and allow her to actually introduce the panelists and drive the conversation. So Sophia, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Paula. I am so excited about this panel and this discussion that we're going to be having today about OOUX and content strategy. I'm really curious, though, before I introduce our panelists, I'm also going to do like a 5-minute what is OOUX overview. So I got a few slides for you, but I'm just curious in the chat, let me know, have you heard of object-oriented UX? Have you played around with it at all? Do you have any experience? I'm just curious to see, we've got a great turnout here. We've got over 70 people, which is awesome, but I'm just really curious. Are you coming at this without having have never heard of OOUX until you saw the invite to Content Strategy Seattle? Have you maybe read a couple? Oh, we got some, hey, Mark at Mark's in cohort 7. Awesome. Heard of it. Okay. Oh yeah, the happy hour with Scott Kuby. That was a good one. Also, he was on the podcast too. That's another good one too. Okay, all right. So we've got some new people. Complete OOUX. That's okay. It's okay. We're gonna get you up to speed, and we're gonna get you up to speed, especially from a content strategy perspective. OOUX curious. Nice. Sharon. Hi, Sharon from cohort 4. Nice, awesome, very cool. All right. So, and Timmy. Hi, Timmy's doing self-paced. Wonderful. What a cool group. Okay. So I am going to do my slides real quick, get my safety blanket of Keynote, because you've got to have the visuals or otherwise I won't know what I'm talking about. All right. So what the heck is this OOUX thing? Let's talk about it. Where's my, somebody put put a stopwatch on me and start beeping at me after I go 5 minutes. Okay, so OOUX is basically a philosophy. It stands for object-oriented UX. And this is a philosophy for designing digital systems that respect the fact that people think in objects. And because people think in objects, they need consistent and recognizable objects to understand an environment or product. You've got to make those objects clear to be able to get stuff done in an environment. It's just how our brain works. If you are interested in some of the psychology, I obviously don't have time to get into that in the next 5 minutes, but if you're like, well, do people actually think in objects? I've got some backup on that. So you can go over to my Medium, Sophia VUX. I'll pop some links after I stop talking. But there's a really, or you just can Google the object-oriented user, or the other article is called Don't Dead Him. Those are the 2 deep dives that I go into the psychology, but, or maybe you can we get into it in Q&A, I don't know. But there's a lot of backup to this. I've done a lot of cognitive science studying, and everything points to the fact that we really do think in objects. So what do I mean when I say objects? What are objects in the 4 walls of the OOUX-averse? When I'm saying objects, I kind of think content types, like a more expansive idea of content type. These are the archetypical real world things that people care about. You can kind of think of it like the templates. So if I'm thinking about YouTube, that might be the video, the playlist, the channel, the products that the YouTubers are selling. What else in YouTube? Those are like the main ones that I'm thinking of. Shorts, right? People are doing shorts in YouTube. So that's the stuff of YouTube, right? And then we have instances, and I really like to differentiate objects and instances. So instances are examples of the object. It's the stuff that's churned out by the templates. Sometimes I say that objects are the cookie cutter and instances are the cookies that get churned out from the cookie cutter. So if it's a video on a video on YouTube, that might be noun foraging with robots and Rick Williams, a great OOUX happy hour that y'all should definitely check out with one of our panelists. That might be on a playlist. An instance of a playlist might be OOUX happy hour. I do have that playlist. It exists. And a channel might be Sophia Prater. Okay. And then the Zoom. What are you doing to me? What are you doing to me, Zoom? Okay. We're back in Keynote. There we go. And then the other thing I really like to differentiate is components, because a lot of times when people think object-oriented UX, they might think design system and think about like, oh, it's all the objects within the screens, like the nav bars and the buttons and the dropdown. Isn't that just a design system? No, 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 no. I really like to differentiate these. The components are the UI elements that the user actually touch. And I consider that kind of like the packaging for the object instances. Okay. So I'm a big fan of Mike Atherthon and Carrie Hane. Their book, Designing Connected Content, is very OOUX-y. And they write in this wonderfully delicious book, people don't care about the containers, they care about the things that they contain. And I'm probably preaching to the choir here. My version of this is your users are not coming to your app for your calendar picker. They're coming for the event or whatever that thing is, right? They're not coming to play with the buttons and the toggles. And on the UX side, I know that y'all are fighting the good fight for this. On the UX side, as you know, you probably have worked with UX designers that are very, very focused on the UI elements. And which is, I mean, what Design Systems has done. It's been amazing for our industry. It's a really great way to break down complexity. But what we want to do is we really want to start with what is being packaged by those components, right? So I often say, like, we got to figure out first, what do people actually want? Are they looking for ketchup or motor oil or Windex? And then we'll design really, really great packaging. We'll design the cool spray bottle. So that is really what OOUX is all about, is figuring out first, what are the objects, and then coming up with a really nice packaging. So we, the OOUXers, this is kind of like the manifesto. We answer these questions before we start designing screens. And that is, what are the objects in the user's mental model? What are the objects' relationships to each other? How do the objects connect in our particular context? What calls to action do objects offer users? So what do users want to do to those objects? What are the affordances of those objects? And then what attributes make up the objects? And this aligns to my very favorite acronym in the whole world, ORCA. So we've got OOUX, the philosophy that we've already talked about. And then I like to differentiate that between ORCA, which is the iterative framework with the pink and the yellow and the green. The pink, the yellow, the green, and the blue. It's a little bit late here on the East Coast. Sticky notes, right? So that's the color coding, that's the framework. That is this really nice system for basically translating research and requirements into clarified design structure. Okay, so when the rubber hits the road, a lot of what OOUX is about is creating an object map. We've got a whole lot of other artifacts, about like 5 or 6 different artifacts that are created during the ORCA process. But the object map is really the darling. And for a long time, for the first 3 or 4 or 5 years that I was working and I was doing OOUX, it was really just object mapping. So this is an example of an object map, and it really does help kind of give you X-ray vision of your system. So we've got our objects across the top: chef, recipe, event, property, and guest. And then down the side, we basically are having an inventory of our attributes. In OOUX, we like to separate core content from metadata, core content being things like descriptions and images and video files, things like that, that kind of are the unique identifiers of an instance, and then metadata being the things that users typically would sort and filter by. So we separate those out. And then we also are very much conscientious about logging those relationships and getting the cardinality right between those relationships, and making sure those relationships are paving the way for navigation. So here I can start seeing all the bits and pieces of an event, and it's almost like a proto wireframe. So we've got title, main image, description, date and time. And I can also see that an event has one-to-many recipes demoed. And I can imagine that from here, I could click on one of these recipes, go see the recipe, see the title, the image, the directions, favorite, whether it's been favorited or not by the particular user, the chef that's the author of that recipe, and click over to the chef. So you can start seeing, imagine if you have 10, 12, 15 objects, you can really get that nice bird's eye view of the system, and also start seeing all that nice cross-linking too. Okay, so one thing we want to make really clear is this is not replacing any of your current tools or work. This is something to kind of add to your existing process, right? It's not like this is a completely new way of doing things, and you just need to scrap everything you're doing. So you've probably seen some sort of version of this before, the double diamond. We've got research and we've got design. And this to me has always been the weak spot, especially in the beginning of my career before I started doing OOUX. I'd get all this research, or not much research at all, and then kind of be fumbling around with synthesizing it. But really, I was starting with just sketching out screens. And that's where a lot of designers are starting, is kind of taking in the research sort of fuzzily and then starting to design screens. So what the ORCA process gives you is almost like a third diamond, a third opportunity to diverge, converge, and also this provides this really nice gauntlet as well to let you know when you're not ready to go into design, when you haven't really figured out the content, you haven't really figured out the information architecture. So really, complexity just can't hide from this process. So it's a really great way to collaboratively even get your stakeholders to see the level of complexity and pop back to research, so that you don't go into design with a bunch of high-risk assumptions. So OOUX supports everything you and your team already do and know, and it kind of provides a nice framework around it. Of course, this is the world that I see everything through OOUX lens. So I see OOUX at the center of everything. But from what I've heard from a lot of other folks too, is it does provide sort of a backbone that all these other systems can kind of, and other activities can work around. So I'm going to introduce my panelist. I do have a link for you here. That link will have resources specifically for content strategy. I should just go ahead and add those, the psychology ones that I mentioned. So you don't have to worry about those. So it'll be a list of resources for you. I also have a discount code for you for $100 off the masterclass. If that's something you've been interested in. There's only 10 spots for that though. So, okay. So let me stop share, because now we can, and what you might want to try doing. So as I introduce folks, I think you can pin people. We should be floating up to the top if you go into speaker view, but I think you might be able to pin us too. I don't know, play around with it. Okay, so let me introduce myself a little bit more first. So looking at my notes, how do I introduce myself? I consider myself the chief evangelist for object-oriented UX. I've been shouting from the rooftops about OOUX since about 2015. It has changed my life and my process and made UX in particular so much more fun and collaborative. And it's really helped prevent a lot of frustration in my career. A lot of that designing in the dark that I don't especially like has really, really helped me. So I want to share it with as many people as possible. So I do that through OOUX Happy Hour, which is a meetup that we have usually once a month. I've got a podcast, the OOUX podcast, also the certification program. We've got some folks here today. A lot of our panelists have been certified or are going through the self-paced masterclass. And I live outside of Atlanta. Spent a lot of time in Atlanta. Now I'm about 90 minutes outside of Atlanta in the North Georgia mountains at the foot of the Appalachian Trail. Okay, so who else do we have here? All right, so Katrina, we've got Katrina Schwieterman, and Katrina has over 18 years of experience in the content world. She has really found her true passion in content design. She has been all over the place with startups, large companies, everything from, was it Redfin? Not Redfin. Yeah, Redfin to Microsoft. She was recently at Meta. When I met Katrina, she was at Meta, which I think was Facebook when I met you, and is now at Shopify. Rick Williams, say hi, Rick, kind of wave or something. I don't see you in my panel. Rick Williams is up very late right now. It's like 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning for Rick. He's calling in from the UK. And he's a content strategist at Government Digital Services, so working on uk.gov. And he is also a certified OOUXer, as well as Katrina is also a certified OOUXer. He has multiple articles out there on OOUX and also did the noun foraging meetup, which was really awesome. One of our most popular meetups on how to automate your noun foraging. And Rick is just overall an awesome person. And we also have Jillian Rochelle, also certified OOUX strategist. She's a lead content strategist at EPAM Systems, and she's worked in a variety of complex industries, healthcare, pharmaceuticals, financial services. And then we've got Gina Cairney. Gina, I did not check to make sure I'm saying your last name correct. Is it Cairney?
Yes.
Yes. So, okay, wonderful. Gina is a content designer, writer, and artist living in Brooklyn. They have a decade of experience making people click on things. So we are excited to have everybody here. Gina's in the self-paced program, rocking that right now. And yeah, let's go ahead and kick it off. Let's get to some of these questions. So I'm going to start, actually, Katrina, I'm going to start with you. And I think, actually, Paula, are you still spotlighted? Because I'm just seeing you. Katrina, say something and see if you get.
Hello, everybody.
I'm not intentionally spotlighted, so yeah.
Okay, cool. I think it's working. It's working. Awesome. Okay. So my first question is for you, Katrina. So you've said before, you told me before that OOUX helps you level up in tackling complexity. Can you kind of just explain that? Like how did OOUX do that? And what kind of complexity were you dealing with at the time?
Absolutely, I can explain it. First of all, hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm in Seattle, so it's great to join the Seattle meetup for content strategists. And also, it turns out it's a global event. Like, it's so awesome to see everybody from all over the world.
I know, right?
So yeah, my story of origin when I met OOUX was, I think in 2019. I was in my first year working at Meta, and I was working on a team that was focused on building experiences for managing your business accounts. And business accounts contain all of the different type of accounts that can belong to a business, like Instagram accounts, Facebook pages, pixels, ad accounts, all of those things. And it helped you manage the people who had access to those accounts and the actions they could take on the tools or on the surfaces that Meta has, which is like Instagram, Facebook, and also all of the business tools. And oh my gosh, that was complicated. And every time, like, we were basically the management surface for it. And so you had to have conversations with teams who were like, I want to introduce a new object. And so you'd have to have a conversation about, is this really an object? And what is it related to? And so I was desperately looking for tools that would help me just deal with complex and to like work through the complexity and think about the structure of accounts and how things are related and actions you had permissions to take, and helped to kind of govern this, but also help teams identify the right thing to build. I just happened, I think, to come across OOUX and got very excited because it just seemed like such a useful tool. And it turned out to be very much so. So it armed me with some additional tools and really some concepts to think about, to like just simple acronyms like SIP to identify what an object is. So it has—
What's SIP?
SIP, which means structure, instance, and purpose. And then you can have a very real conversation with the team about whether or not this was a real object. And also just the whole idea about different cardinality of relationship between objects, which could determine the actions that you could take. It gave me a tool to actually map out those relationships and talk about that with teams. And so it made it much more of a visual conversation. And all of those things like just helped me more easily like figure out and work through the complex differences for all of these different use cases that kept just kind of flying in from different teams.
As a user of Facebook business tools, as a very light user of Facebook business tools, I mean, we had some calls about it too, because it was so confusing for me as a user. And I still remember just like figuring out like, okay, what is an ad? Like, what is actually an ad versus like, there was like a promoted post. So it's like, there was ads, there was promoted posts. Then there was like another one that I was like, I didn't know the difference between it. And I think campaign was used too. So even just from like a labeling perspective, there was a lot of things that I didn't understand as a user. I didn't understand the difference between those things and what it actually meant as far as how people were seeing it and where it was going to be delivered. So yeah, very, very complicated. Jillian, you told me something similar, that it helped you it helped you actually get confidence to take on more complexity, and ask the right questions up front. So can you talk a little bit more about that and like what that looks like for you today?
Sure. So I think, first of all, hi, everybody. Nice to see you all. I think for me, OOUX and the ORCA process in particular provide a framework for tackling complexities in a project space, because I think, everyone's had the experience of being on a project or starting on a project, and the desire is to very quickly like, okay, let's get into sprints, let's get into features. And as I think you mentioned, Sophia, in your intro, that leads to a lot of unexamined assumptions, let's say. That's where I find OOUX really helpful, is in terms of working on projects, like being able to ask certain questions, like, what are people coming to this product, this experience for? How does it work? Like how does the user flow through things? What happens when they, register, when they, click another CTA, like, answering those very basic questions at the beginning, because I have found in projects previously that not answering those questions is where you really run into a lot of problems when you're trying to start the actual building. That's, I think it seems elementary to most people on a project team just to say like, okay, how does this thing work? But it's so important. It's so important that everyone understands it. Everyone is aligned about like, how does this product work currently? And then we can talk about how do we want to build it to work in the future. I think for me, that's where OOUX comes in very handy.
It's like the graphic that has been passed around for the last 40 years or something of the swing set, and like everybody having a different idea on what the swing is supposed to actually be. Like we still deal with that. That was a project management graphic. I used it in an article and I looked it up. It really was like, I don't know, from the 70s. I couldn't even find an attribution for it, but we're still dealing with that. So OOUX like kind of helps get everybody having the same picture, and the same language too, like calling things the same thing, right? So yeah, working
can't reiterate that enough. Calling things the same things, like everyone aligning on how we refer to things, whether that's how we refer to things internally, how we refer to things when we're talking to the customer. Like, let's all have alignment on what the lexicon is. That's so important.
Yeah, definitely. Gina, hi. So I'm very curious. So Gina's doing self-paced. Gina and I haven't actually met yet, except for in the Slack channel. So I'm really curious. Gina, can you talk to us a little bit about how OOUX fits into your content strategy work, or how it's starting to?
Yeah. So I'm relatively new to the UX side of content work. I've been doing kind of like marketing communications prior to this. And so when I came across OOUX, it just intuitively made sense to me. And it just kind of fit into what I've, I guess, always been doing with marketing work. But it allowed me to really easily kind of transition. It changed my way of thinking, or like perspective of how do you think about content from a marketing communications perspective into a UX perspective. So it's like, like the fun question of like, what's the difference between marketing and content design? Or, it's like, well, one of them you try to sell stuff. The other one is like, you're kind of selling stuff, but you're actually trying to get people to use whatever it is that is being sold by your marketing team. And so that's kind of like how I've been able to loosely start incorporating more of the OOUX into like what I'm doing. And so it's definitely helped me take kind of the existing structure at Cvent, which is where I work. It kind of modify it in a way where, okay, these are the questions that I want to ask, or this is the information I need to know to be able to do my part of the work so that I can effectively collaborate with the product designers. But I think in another way, it's also allowed me to act as a more effective collaborative partner rather than just purely a content person. Like I'm not always just there to write stuff. I like my teammates, we work really well together, and they're always, they ask me questions, I ask them questions. I kind of, and OOUX helps me kind of bring in questions with that kind of specific framework in mind, I guess, to ask questions that maybe like we wouldn't consider if that didn't exist or that wasn't available.
So I'm going to put you on the spot here. Do you have an example? Like tell me a little bit more about Cvent and what Cvent does, the kind of stuff that the kind of complexity, and like maybe like a recent thing that you were working on where like, do you remember any like of those questions? Like, can you give us an example?
Yeah. So, I mean, in like summary, Cvent is, I've only been there for like 9 months, but they're like a services and tools company. They in the hospitality and events industries, and so they offer like a suite of products and features to allow people like hoteliers or planners to, do management type stuff, to be able to like, I don't know, allow vendors or people to kind of book hotels, or if you have like an event that you want to stream, then you can do kind of like webinars. So like similar to, I guess, what Zoom does, but on a bigger scale. So that's kind of like what they do in a nutshell. I'm on the hospitality side. So what I do is I work with product designers to kind of look at the supplier and planner side of things. So that includes anything like the tools that people might, like an event planner might use to source venues for like a big conference or something. And then I guess like the biggest example that I just did was I did a full content audit, which I think is a topic that we'll touch on later. But the content audit was like the first time I actually did a full OOUX approach. And it was just kind of sweeping through everything and like, okay, I'm trying to understand the relationship of things, like, but what's the relationship with the product to the person using it, the different types of people using it. So it's weird because it was kind of like an overlap with what maybe a product designer might do in mapping out a user flow. But it wasn't really concerned about the specifics of the UI. It was just more like, does the information make sense? Is it coherent across the plane of steps? Is it, are the labels used consistently, right? So it's just like a lot of like really looking at the small details in that way. So yeah, that's like the first example that I like fully did that whole thing with.
So, and I just want to say, so what I was doing when Gina was explaining Cvent is I talked about noun foraging. I think I mentioned noun foraging already, but I was noun foraging what Gina was saying to help me understand what Cvent does. So I'm listening for things just to understand the structure. So I'm listening, I'm thinking, okay, we've got events, we've got venues, we've got hotels, what are some other things?
Events, there were hotels, there's the planner, there's a
supplier. Yes.
Vendors.
And so once you start like pulling those things out and then start seeing the connections, I often say OOUX is a tool for understanding, just figuring out what are the things. So when people are explaining to me things, I kind of have this bias to listen to, okay, what nouns are, and then I can start saying things like, oh, like what is the relationship between a hotel and a supplier? Are these like, and that can help define the things through the relationships. All right, let's get to Rick. Let's talk to Rick for a second. And I'm kind of going through everybody to just kind of get an overview on your experience with OOUX, and then we'll get into some more of the nitty gritty. And actually, before I ask you the question that I'm going to ask you, I forgot to kind of go over ground rules as far as the panel is concerned. I hope to get into some nitty gritty here. I want y'all to, I'm going to open things up to the floor. It's totally okay if two people speak at once. We'll work through that. So don't feel like you need to like wait or anything. Feel free to pop in. Feel free to interrupt each other. Feel free to even debate each other. Okay. We're in the trust tree here. So if Katrina says something and Gina, maybe you've had a different experience, pipe up. Okay. So I think we can kind of like, let's just say that that's okay to do that, to debate, and even ask each other questions too. So if one of the panelists is telling a story, and for example, if you have a question for Gina, just interrupt me and pop in there. So I'll try to breathe between my sentences to give you a chance to get you a word in edgewise. So Rick, you mentioned that. Hi, Rick. Glad you're still awake. You mentioned that OOUX helps synthesize these messy piles of research. I spoke to this a little bit, and synthesize all that research into scalable, user-centered structure. How is, now that you're really in a focused content strategy position, how does that work from a content strategy perspective?
It's a good question. So what I found this part of OOUX really useful for is when, how do you move from, we have data, maybe that's data from other domains, maybe it's inventories, audits, or kind of primary research data, maybe it's user interviews or transcripts or social listening, but how do you go from, we have lots of stuff that we've just created, or even stuff we've inherited from previous cycles of research or previous teams or agencies or whatever you might have, like somewhere in the cloud. How do you do stuff to that with that to make it useful? And so one of the things, what strands of the ORCA process that's really helpful is being able to kind of forage. A lot of that content is usually wrapped up in text or textual data of different kinds, or can be wrapped up in textual data if you get an audio recording and having machine transcribed or even manually transcribed. But how do you do something with that, particularly as a content strategist or an architect? And one of the things I found really useful is taking on foraging and going through that content and trying to uncover the parts of the world in which, on one hand, you have users, and on the other hand, you have the organization. And what are the things in particular that are in that world? What kind of scale, kind of frequency, and potentially going further into maybe some of the parts, the attributes or call to actions, but it's especially the things, the entities, the objects, and trying to get a really decent handle relatively quickly if you're using software to do the heavy lifting for you in the foraging, so that you can be primed and briefed at the very minimum to set up other work, or like you showed in the kind of triple diamond or diamond and a half, that you have a pretty good idea about things you might want to go back into research and probe more. Are these things true? To what extent are they true? Do we need to find out more about this particular thing because it looks juicy, but we've got lots of assumptions about whether that's actually relevant to the world or the mission of the project. So in kind of summary, that's one of the things that the ORCA process can really help with, especially at the outset of a project in particular. How do you take this data and use it? It's been quite hard to really use some of the fidelity that you can capture with some of the tools we have today, and really kind of use that beyond just what you hear or make notes about, perhaps in an interview or a research session.
So at when you're working on UK.gov, is that right? Is that one or one of the websites?
On Gov.uk, it's the kind of the single
Gov.uk, sorry.
Yeah, we're outside US, and but we're it's a really interesting domain. It's a big project kicked off about 11 years ago now to unify government under a single code-based content strategy design language and a single domain rather than each department running its own site or multiple sites. And it's been quite a kind of success story in the UK and beyond. Other governments, including the Aussies and the Americans, have come to like learn how to kind of structure content and to make government accessible to people. So that's kind of where I've started working. I've only been there about 2 months so far, but my journey with OOUX kind of goes back, getting really close to 10 years, about 2013, and the first List Apart article. It was sometimes you're on a project, you're kind of at an impasse, you're a bit stuck, you're scratching your head, but you don't necessarily know where to go to find the answer. And then every so often something just lands in your lap and hits the nail on the head. And for me, an example of this was the List Apart article back in the day, maybe about 2013.
2015. It wasn't that long ago.
2013, I swear it was a long time ago, but I was working at a university in higher ed. These are universities, if any of you have ever worked with them, are interesting beasts because they share a logo, the power to award degrees, but then the parts of the university might as well be different organizations or fiefdoms, the centers, the departments. And I had to try and find a way to redo news at the university. And I knew that solving it for the marketing department wouldn't really solve the whole problem because all of the real news was happening in the departments and bubbling up from where the research is happening or where the students are. And it was a bit of a head scratcher because there was a real opportunity to not just make a newfangled responsive version of the central news site. And I bumped into the article and it was the proverbial penny dropped that these are just things. Press releases, news articles, academics, perhaps students, perhaps units of the university. These are all tangible things that are agnostic, or even of the university itself, that is true in the world. Any university has those parts. How do you begin to model and define that so you can make one solution for everybody? And then just cascade that news and nest it in the academic that did the cool thing, or the center where they work to do the research, and in the central kind of Uber index. And so that's kind of my journey into thinking in OO and kind of applying it.
That's awesome. Thanks. So I see in the chat, are we getting a walkthrough of a project or a job using this approach in the session? I think basically, so thinking about Rick's university example, so the walkthrough really is, if I can do it really quickly, I'm guessing like you're identifying what those things are, right? So what were some of the things you just mentioned with your university example? I have goldfish brain right now.
So you've got academics, you've got departments and centers, so the organizational units. For news, you've got things that are kind of content type objects, so press releases, articles themselves. You might have a press officer, which is a mixture of a role and a tangible thing, a person in the world. That perhaps the person that writes the articles, owns them, is the contact point for press. You might have other things like courses, perhaps, that are relevant to these articles. So all of the building blocks of a university.
And then basically the next step, so if we go through the ORCA process, we're figuring out what the objects are. And that can sometimes be a real challenge, just figuring out what the things are. That's where the noun foraging comes in, listening for the nouns that you're hearing over and over and over again. And then it's a matter of connecting them through the relationship. So saying something like, okay, do press releases and departments connect to each other? It's like a press release underneath a department. Do courses, how do courses and departments, do you have press releases about courses? So it's figuring out all of those kind of questions about how the stuff relates to each other. And then the C is like, okay, what do people do to these things? Like, can I sign up for a course within this system, right? Can I actually enroll in a course? Can I contact an officer? What are all those things? And then figuring out all those attributes that help with the categorizing. So things like, okay, an officer has a first name, a last name. Officer's got a picture. Officer has a title or role, a number of years experience or something like that, a department that they're attached to. So that is it in a nutshell. But we're not going to get into, I think, like case studies right now. We're more just talking about how OOUX is working from a content strategy perspective. So in that vein, let's talk about content models first and content modeling. So I hear a lot, like Jillian's laughing. Maybe we'll start with you, Gillian. Like I hear like, what's the difference between a content model and an object map? Or like, if you're doing content modeling, do you need OOUX? Jillian, did you have a thought on that? I saw you laughing.
Yeah, I do have a thought. I'm smiling because that's a question I asked during my cohort. But I would say, like, the way I understand it, having gone through the ORCA process, as part of the masterclass, is I would look at an object map as kind of a way of understanding an entire experience or system, right? Like, what are the different parts of it? How are they related to one another? And I feel like a content model is where you're getting into the nitty-gritty of defining content and really like fleshing out what are the requirements for the content that you've identified in the object map, right? So if we say that, profile is an object, what goes with the profile in terms of content, or content might be a bio or, an image. And then in the content model is where you would say, okay, well, what goes into a bio? What are the requirements for images? Do we have file requirements or what have you? So that's how I understand it. Like, the object map is kind of the big picture view of the entire system or the entire product, whereas the content model is when you're really like getting into, okay, what's the substance of the content going to be? I don't know if anyone else views it that way.
Yeah. Anybody else on the panel want to pipe up content model versus object map?
I think Jillian said it very well. I would have said the same thing. Like, I think there's similarities, like you're identifying the purpose of objects and the relationships between objects. And a content model is the purpose of a piece of content and the relationship it has with other content. But I think maybe the difference is, for me, like, you're not thinking about acting upon the content necessarily. Maybe you're acting upon a group of content that's prioritized in a certain way. But yeah, I think that for me is where the difference lies. But I agree with Jillian. It's about really specking out like the considerations for the content, the different content pieces.
And content models will show relationships between the content, right?
Yeah.
And then it'll just kind of be focused on the yellow sticky notes, right? Is that okay? The yellow sticky notes is core content. So those descriptions, images, stuff that somebody has to make, right? So does metadata come into a content model ever?
I think it depends on how you build your content model. I think that some of the parts of a content model and an object map are shared or can be shared. In your content model, you might have entities or things, and you may start to define some of the attributes of those, and you might usually diagram your object model as with relationships and lines, and maybe layer on cardinality depending how detailed or high level you go. So there are some things that definitely overlap in the shared, but I think in an object map you're escaping some of the limits of that type of diagram. It can get very messy very quickly, lots of arrows going all over the place. How do you capture that much data in kind of a that kind of boxes and arrows model, whereas an object map lets you kind of have that kind of stability of all of the parts, the objects, perhaps the call to actions, the metadata, the attributes, as well as bringing in some of the relationships. So in what's being shared on the screen at the moment, at the bottom of this this map, you can kind of see some blue post-it notes with some relationships. So a guest has 0 to many events that are upcoming. You're still capturing this information, but it's more stable. You can include more data, and you can extend this out of boxes, no arrows, into other documentation, whether that's in spreadsheets or Trello or wherever you're working, and you kind of have that more complete, stable and detailed overview that's easier to work with as well. But they do cross over if you have a mental Venn diagram of them, some of the things that you might have in both an object map and a content model.
So Kiki's asking, can a content model exist inside of an object map, like a Figma or design layout? So I see like the content model and the object map as like I might start with a content model, because I do what I call it a system model, which is basically boxes and arrows. But then to Rick's point, if I'm dealing with 20 objects, which in some sort of enterprise systems, I very well might be dealing with 17, 18, 19 objects. And then some of those objects have multiple relationships between it. Like in this case, the one that Rick was pulling out, a guest has 0 to many upcoming events, has 0 to many events attended. That's 2 different types of relationships between a guest and an event. I've got upcoming, I've got upcoming, and I've got past events. And I want to break that out and say that we want to actually be able to say that a guest might even be able to host events too, as a guest has 0 to many events hosting. I don't know, maybe they're not a guest. But you can even have, I've had 2 objects before that have like 6 different relationships. And when you're in boxes and arrows, that just turns into a bowl of spaghetti pretty quickly. So I think it's like good for those really core kind of like almost like the initial piece. I would say I would like start with the content model and then turn it into the object map to scale. So if I have, let's say a property, this is a really simplified object map. I've seen object maps where an object might have 60, 70, 80 attributes to it. Like in an electronic healthcare record, the patient has like 600 attributes. And with this, you can actually document that. You can actually start documenting it and then put, even to Rick's point, like you can go in and add this to a spreadsheet. We have some like Notion templates. People do a lot with Airtable too. And then you can actually add requirements into each of these. So you can start saying, okay, the main image, this is the aspect ratio. This is the type of style that we're requiring for event images. The description needs to include X, Y, Z. So you can actually start adding that in at an attribute level. Gina, do you have any other thoughts on that, the content model versus object map question?
Yeah, I think what Jillian said is like pretty spot on. I think the other way of thinking, or to add to that, is rather than seeing the content model and the object mapping as 2 separate things, that they're more complementary, right? So I guess the way that I've looked at that is the object mapping kind of gives you an eagle's eye view or the forest view, and you're just kind of trying to bucket things, right? Try to understand the relationship of what it is that you want to do. And then the content model, if you're getting into the nitty gritty of it, are the trees, like the individual pieces that then get attached to the objects themselves. And so I think kind of answering Key's question about kind of content models exist inside of object maps, I think they can. It's like, if you kind of think about it as the content model having a relationship with the object map, and that what you're doing is like, if you're doing like infinite zoom of something, right? You like start out really wide and then like you go in, and then like that content model could become like an object map of that specific thing. And then you zoom in even more. And then it's just like, they kind of swap places as you zoom in more and more and more. So I think it just depends on like where your focus is, right? So you look really big and then you start focusing more narrowly, and then that becomes like a subset object map of the larger piece. It's like, that's kind of how I've looked at
it. Content model, object mapping, inception. Awesome. Okay. Did I just say content audit, content model? Now let's talk about content audits. Any other questions? I'm looking at the chat right now on like content models versus object maps. I guess I wonder how OOUX could help thing through a domain that at first glance seems too abstract and difficult to bring into tangible objects. Yes. Like government content that's very rights, responsibilities. Yes, Angus, you are, we're on the same wavelength. So often I hear like, oh, well, we don't really have very concrete objects. Like our objects are really abstract. So I don't think OOUX could work for us. Like OOUX would work for like things that, an example that I give is like a trail finder app. I use that a lot as an example, which is but it's good for an example because it has like nice concrete objects. The thing that I like to say about like, if the more abstract the objects are, the more important it is to make them tangible, the more this kind of work is helpful and actually gets everybody on the same page with those abstract objects. The other thing is when you get really clear on the relationships between objects, the reason that it's so good to link your objects together is because it helps define the objects. So if you have quite a few abstract objects and it's going to be harder for your user to understand them too. But even if you have a few objects that are less abstract and more concrete, like, I can't think of what's the government, like you might have like a government department and then compliance documents or something like that. I don't know. What I'm trying to say here is the more you can be very clear about the relationship within your team and also then to the end users, because you got to get it clear within your team first to then translate it to your end users. If you have an abstract concept and then you link it and you make it very clear on how that abstract concept relates to a concrete concept, the easier it is going to be to understand that abstract concept. So, okay, I'll give you an example from Edtech. Edtech, we had teachers, students, lessons. We also had lesson plans. We had standards. We had quizzes. We had standardized tests. We had all sorts of objects. Now, some of those are more concrete than others. Like a lesson is much more concrete than a lesson plan. So we were very careful to make it very clear what the relationship is between a lesson plan and a lesson. Standard is another thing that's a lot more abstract within the Edtech. So we had to make it really, really clear. How does a standard relate to classes and students and lessons? So you can kind of like, the more you can leverage your concrete objects through the relationships. Anyway, I could talk about that all day long, but yes, Angus, yes, OOUX can help with that.
Sophia, I think that's one of the really helpful things about OOUX is when you do your object discovery, you're also starting to think about, okay, why is this an object? What's its structure? What's its, what are some example instances? What's the object's purpose? So I think even like you were saying, even if an object seems somewhat abstract, once you can put that, kind of put it to the test of that structure, instances, and purpose framework, I think that's when you start to get clear about, okay, this is an object, and now let's figure out how it relates to other objects.
Yes, of course. Yeah. 100%. Cool. So we went off on a little tangent there on content modeling and on abstract objects. And I'm curious. I had a question. Another question that I was gonna ask, and then I lost it. Any other thoughts on that? Like the abstract objects versus concrete objects, and being able to like concretize your abstract objects. Have y'all had any like really, Katrina, I know you have at Meta, there was a lot of abstract objects, right?
I can't think of an example.
I mean, even like a campaign, it's like, what is a campaign? Is a campaign a group of ads? Like, and yeah. I remember there was ones that just like, because I wasn't grounded in there was like, I came in knowing what some things were. And then there was these other objects. And I was like, how does that connect to that? Okay, let's talk about content audits. So I have never done a content audit. I am starting to feel like I need to do a content audit for OOUX.com because OOUX.com is starting to grow. We have over 200 resources on there, and just kind of I've been rereading Paula's book and also Christina's book, and I'm just getting really inspired to like, oh, I want to do a content audit. What I'm confused about with content audits, so this is like, now hopefully y'all can teach me. And what I've always kind of like wondered about with content audits is, yes, I know I need to audit my kind of snowflake pages or my static pages, but what about when you have all these instances? So when you have like, I have like my resources landing page that has content audit, but then I have a resource and I have 200 resources. How does that work with and just kind of like opening up how does OOUX and content audits, can they work together? And how do you handle when you not only have like 200 instances, but maybe 200,000 instances of something? How does that work? And I'll hand it over to Gina, because I know that you just did a content audit, right? And you were using some OOUX on it?
Yeah, so this product was like a audit from scratch. It was just something that I was like, oh, I could totally like, let's try this, because I've never done an audit before. Being new to OOUX, I was like, I want to see if I understand just the concept of OOUX. So like, let's just dive right in. It's the audit that I did for the product isn't that big. Like, it's definitely not the biggest thing for CVent. Like, it's pretty small compared to a lot of the other stuff that we work on. But yeah, to your point, like, what do you do when you have like a bajillion objects or a bajillion like actions or bajillion metadata or whatever? And so when I was going through the audit, I started noticing patterns like that where, okay, there's like a lot of metadata, like there's a lot of instances, but there's also a lot of like objects or metadata or whatever that were also repeating. So I was like, okay, I'll just like make a note of it. And what I started doing after like the 5th time I've seen something is then give that repeating pattern kind of like a label, right? So that I don't have to I don't have to keep tabs of every single instance of that thing coming up, but just make a note of it and say, okay, this is a recurring pattern, so I'll just bucket it as a pattern. So it's like, I don't know if it's like throwing a wrench into the whole thing, right? Because now we're talking about patterns, but yeah. And then once I was able to figure that out and just kind of bucket things like that, I was able to, I guess, control it a little bit better over the course of the full audit. That then got more complicated as it started funneling in through like the specific flows of different users. So I don't know if like that's helpful, but that's, and then there's the other question of like, okay, is this an instance or an object, or is this metadata? Like, how do you decide? Which I don't have an answer for, other than maybe it depends. So
did you have any objects that had a ton of instances within what you were doing, within the content audit that you were doing?
Yeah, there's it's a, most of it had to do with sourcing venues. And so within that, it's like, okay, there's a venue, but within venues, there's different types of venues. And then within that, there's different regions and locations and states, right? And so it got really blurry. It's like, is this an instance or is this metadata? Like, what can they be both? So it got kind of complicated to figure out, like, for the purposes of what we're trying to do, because I was given an objective of what they wanted to do with this product. I was like, okay, I'll keep that in mind. So knowing that objective, it's kind of like, okay, I'll just go ahead and decide for this audit specifically that this thing is not an instance, it's a metadata, or vice versa. So
what would be one thing that you were like confused, like, is it an instance or is it metadata? Because I would never think that they could be both. But you could have something that's like a value of metadata.
Yeah. So
so it's like, I guess it depends on like what part of the flow you're in. But so one of the ones that seemed interchangeable was the location of a venue, right? Like that could be metadata, but
Right.
that could be an instance if it's part of like the object of the location, like just the state.
So like a
or
location
whatever.
being like Seattle.
Yeah, or like if the location was Washington State, right? And then within Washington State, you had regions, and then within regions, you had specific cities.
And that gets into, so one of the, like the big things that we talk about in OOUX is like metadata versus an object. So do we kind of like once location has its own attributes, right? Then we usually, so it starts having SIP, it might act as metadata. So it's a way to sort and filter all my instances of venues. But like if Washington State, we've got like an image of the mountains, and we've got a little blurb on like, what's the weather like in Washington State? Things like that. What's the vibe of Washington State? And then we have all the venues underneath it. Now we've sort of like taken a category and we've upgraded it to an object because it has attributes to it. Yeah. So how do you, anybody else in the panel, how do you do a content audit when you have a ton of instances? Do you log all those instances? Do you let's get into the nitty gritty. Like, what do you do? Do you download it all from your CMS and put it in a spreadsheet so you can see it all?
I definitely, there's different ways to run audits, inventories, and then set them up as audits. But I'm generally personally a fan of using software to usually do a lot of the heavy lifting, whether that's a tool that will, if you're talking about a web domain, spider your competitors or your own site, and then start layering on data as you transfer it into an audit. And from an OO perspective, this can be really interesting because you may find that you're sort of in an OO world, but didn't necessarily realize it. So, for example, the last time I ran a really juicy inventory audit was for an eye hospital in the UK. And part of running that machine crawl of everything, getting all of the URLs, titles, metadata, all of those kind of machine attributes, readable attributes, let me filter and sort the spreadsheets and go, oh, look, we've got an awful lot of consultants. We have an awful lot of conditions. We have an awful lot of locations. These already are set piece examples of objects. And then but then do you need to necessarily audit all 200 consultants? Probably not. You can start sampling them and start looking for and digging into the patterns that may exist. What attributes and metadata are in play already in a domain that you've inherited, or in a domain that's very similar to the one you think you're going to be making something new in. So inventories leading into audits, but particularly machine-built audits, although you can definitely do them by hand, and there's good reasons to do that too, can really jumpstart your understanding of the domain, what's already in there, and then you can start sampling and going deeper into what currently is, which then may trigger a whole load of juicy questions about, well, does that need to continue? Are all of these attributes for a consultant and their metadata? Like, what do they do? Public patients, private patients? Can you book the consultant? Should you be able to book the consultant? Where are they trained? What's their education? Do they need to do any of they will have headshots? Oh, look, half of them don't. There's a silhouette because images are just hard to work. It's surprisingly hard things to work with at scale. You can start digging into these and exposing the questions, and then ultimately maybe bringing it back into an object-based, ORCA-based process. Mm-hmm. So definitely a big fan of inventorying and auditing. If you're dealing with many instances, then you may want to be sampling or layering on other data like from GA to kind of make those choices about where to look.
So one of the things that we do at OOUX is called instancing. So early on in the process, we're finding our objects, and then we come up with some instances, even though those are just example instances, which is like almost like a mini content audit of not all the content, but just your object-based content. So the cookies that are getting churned out from the cookie cutter. So there's that. I also I can see, and I've done this before where I've gotten a content audit and I've used it in noun foraging to see all of these instances. Often the one that I was working on, there was a lot of snowflake plates, things that should be objects, things that should be templatized, but they were, just created bespoke pages every single time. And it helped me kind of back in and say, oh, okay, we need a diagnosis object, or we need a disease object or something like this for this particular one, because we just have all these random pages for it. So I've thought about like content audit being used for noun foraging as like an input, as far as like one of your many inputs to figure out what your objects are. And then also but then I'm like, is there a way to also, after you've done your OOUX and you have a live site like an OOUX.com, and I'm looking at Paula's question too, like if I want to do that qualitative evaluation, I'm just kind of stuck on like how I would go about it, but maybe that's a bigger conversation. I know we probably need to start taking some questions from the group. So anybody else, Jillian, Katrina, ideas on like the merger of OOUX and content auditing?
My advice for your content audit is to start from broad and then go narrow. And so I think that's been mentioned a couple times, but you can look at content strategists and content designers love to think about priority, and often that is determined by usage or volume of engagement. And so if you just purely looked at all of the pages on your site and said which ones are getting the most like views or interaction, that might help focus your efforts. And if you're classifying those by these have a common layout because you've used OOUX to design your site, that might help you understand how those are operating as a group, or like how those are performing as a group. And then you could dig deeper into that group of things to understanding how it's performing. And if you want to make some tweaks, maybe SEO or like the actual actions that you're trying to promote on those pages. So like you can start to get into stuff like that, or you can do more qualitative, like the writing needs to be redone or updated, or it's not consistently presenting this thing. Those can be also part of the audit. But I would start with some numbers to help guide your focus, which can often help you break it down and focus on the most important things first.
That's really helpful. I'm totally going to do that. And maybe I'll find somebody to help me. So I've got a few more questions. I got a lot of questions in my back pocket, but I want to open it up. We've tackled some in the chat, but let me know. Do you have any other questions? Okay, this is from Ben. Has anyone had success creating a single source of truth object map document that a project team can all reference? If so, what tools were used? Single source. I have, but panelists, who is using, if you have created an object map, or when you've created an object map, are other people using it? Or are you doing it for yourself?
I'm mostly doing it for myself, so I can understand, at least the lay of the land of what I'm working on. And I'm usually using Miro to do that, just to, do like a mini system model first, and then translate that into an object map. Again, just so I can understand, okay, what's the relationship between different objects? What's the content that's needed for objects? What about metadata? But I wouldn't call it the single source of truth for the whole project team. It's definitely something that I'm using to get an understanding of what I'm working on.
Can echo with.
Yeah, I definitely concur with that. That if nothing else, it can help you get things out of your head and tie it down. There's a lot of plates to spin in your role as a UX, or even if you're in a larger team. But in terms of like a single source of truth, when I worked at a charity called Alzheimer's Society in the UK, I started by creating it for myself, and then started when it had legs, grew legs, and started getting kind of traction with some of the internal roles and with the agency that would do a lot of the development, some of the interaction design. It started to get enough critical mass that it grew in its definition, it grew in its validity in Mural, where it was kind of at a higher fidelity, a little bit like the slides that kind of Sophia showing today, but then translated out into, in that project, a mixture of Google Sheets and Trello, where you could really start going deeper and holding together some of the kind of really detailed things that you can't just fit in a post-it note. And that was something that was cross-checked by some of the consultants at the agency, some of the internal kind of subject matter experts, content roles that would kind of check and query and feed in and kind of challenge some of the attributes and metadata. And it became for where it was relevant in the project, kind of a living document with a hive, or collection of documents with a hive activity, and eventually was superseded by CMS's code interaction design, and its work was mostly done in the context of that particular project.
So let me get back to, I have definitely used object maps as a single source of truth in a project where especially the developers are working off of it. So this is something that really helps communication with the dev team. It's basically this data first, content first, object oriented. So that kind of resonates with the developers. And the cool thing about it is if you collaborate with them on the object map, figure out where your technical constraints are. Okay, this object doesn't currently talk to this object. These two objects need to talk to each other. There's a relationship. There's a real relationship between there. There's to be a relationship in the database, or we need to get information from an API. That can all be sussed out in the object map. And then while you're working on, if you're a UX designer and you're working on the front end and you're working on screens, you're not a bottleneck for development. They can go start solving some of those problems without screens because they have that X-ray vision of basically the data model. And also content creators can actually okay, we got a yellow sticky note that says video for all of our 200 employees, and we want video interviews for all 200 employees. We've decided that now, okay, we need to hire somebody to do that. We don't need to wait for a screen to come get approved with the video thing on it. We just have a little yellow sticky note, and we want to have little 30-second interviews with all of our employees. Let's go get somebody to do that. So it can help with content, like getting content creation going. You can even, I've worked on projects before when we do our own development here in-house, where we do the object map and we actually build the CMS before we build the screens. So we build that CMS, we start getting real content in, and then we design screen layouts.
Hey, Sophia, there were a couple of questions earlier on that we didn't get to. I just want to make sure and I think some of them can cover, but I just want to make sure we get to everything. Timmy asked, is the object map the same as a domain model?
So it's so domain, I separate, and I'll jump on this and then I want to hear what the panel has to say, but domain objects might not be in your system. So I separate domain and system objects. So it's great to understand your overall domain, but your system might be a small part of that. So sometimes you have a domain model and then you have your system model. And I would say that the biggest thing to think about with an object map is it's really a notation system. It captures basically the same information that an entity relationship diagram captures, but it's scalable just because of the nature of the columns and how you can show those relationships. It does, an ERD is going to break down eventually if you have enough relationships, or if you have an object that has 60, 70 attributes. Good luck making that legible. And also the object map, the format of the object map can be really collaborative. If you're in the space with the sticky notes, whether they're digital sticky notes, great to have, an in-person workshop where everybody has a Sharpie marker in those sticky notes, and you can start building that together. An ERD or a domain model where you have the boxes and arrows is not as easy to collaborate on. So it's a really great collaborative tool too. But I think that the main thing to take away with the object map is it's a notation style. that captures a whole lot of the same information that a domain model or a content model or an ERD would capture.
Cool.
Does anybody else have anything to add to that?
And there was another question early on from Kiki, objects as containers to facilitate an experience. And so without the container, consciousness and action is not focused and guided. Is that the idea? And I think this was referring to a very specific thing you had said back at the start. But does that make sense? Does anybody else have an answer to that one? Might need to hear that one more time. Yeah, so I'll read it again. And it's objects as containers to facilitate an experience. So that's sort of the concept. Without the container, consciousness and action is not focused and guided. So the container is the thing that the container plus the action are sort of the mechanism by which the experience is facilitated, I guess. And then is that sort of the idea? Is it that?
So I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe we're crossing wires, and Kiki, feel free to go off mute if you're still around. But I think of the objects not as the containers. The objects is the substance inside of the container.
Yeah. Oh shoot! It looks like Kiki's not here. Sorry, I would ask them that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think of like going back to that Carrie Hane. That's hard to say. Carrie Hane quote. People don't care about the containers, they care about the things that they contain. So object-oriented UX is all about figuring out what is being contained by all of the boxes. So one thing that you might see like in a design system is you might see something like there's the homepage tile, or there's like the slider or something in the homepage tile. Anything can go in it. We talk about something called masked objects a lot, where you have like 3 different things and they're all wearing the same outfit. So you have a homepage tile container, and it's so flexible. You can put an event in it, or you can put a person in it, or you can put an article in it. And then what it does is it ends up looking exactly the same, which breaks people's minds, because then you have 3 different things all wearing the same outfit, and it's hard to tell what's different. So one thing we advocate is create the container specific to the object. So figure out, do people want Windex or motor oil? And then you design the packaging. I came from an industrial design background, and from an industrial design perspective, you would never create the packaging before you create the actual thing. You create the thing and then you create the packaging for it. And yet we do it backwards all the time. We create a bunch of packaging, and again, I'm probably preaching to the choir, create a bunch of packaging and then be like, let's just shove the stuff in there. And if you do this object thinking first and you figure, okay, we need ketchup, we need mayonnaise, we need motor oil, and we need Windex. And now we can create really good ergonomic, on-brand, accessible, delightful packaging for those things that make it really clear that I'm not, spraying Windex on my sandwich.
There's a great Karen McGrain video from about 15 years ago where she shows an empty gift box, and it was in response to a UX post. Anyhow, that's a fun thing. If I can find that, I'll put it in the Slack. But there was a question also earlier on from Jane asking, what's the best way to conduct user testing using object map? Is it similar to card sorting, or how do you test these objects or their use?
Have any of y'all done any testing on an object map? Panelists?
Yes. There's I don't know if someone else wants to go first though, but I'll continue. So main thing about the work at that eye hospital, we took different bits of the object map. So we didn't necessarily take a total object map and try and work through everything with patients or consultants or those types of users. But what we did at the early outset was focus originally on some of the proto objects and work through those at scale to kind of validate which objects were most essential in the system and what they might be called in terms of the language that people might use to describe them. Do you call like something a disease or a condition or a consultant or a doctor or things like this? and then started to layer on some of the attributes that might give structure and make up and inflate the objects. So what might be relevant to a patient working with patients, and if it was, what kind of hierarchy might it have in terms of importance, or potentially in the actual hierarchy of a kind of the content system. Other ways of using the object map start maybe to step away from touching the map itself. You might start using that to inform early prototyping and bringing in some of that content and hierarchy, and a kind of not working directly with users with the object map, and kind of manifesting it in something they might be more familiar with, or more relevant to the context they might actually encounter what's going on behind the scenes. But it is definitely possible to research with the raw map.
Anybody else? Any advice or ideas on testing? I'll just add that you can teach your users to do this. Like some of the best and actually it's sometimes easier to teach users to do it and non-product people than other UX designers, because they have a very clear idea on how things should work. So users are just like, all right, they're coming in completely blank slate. So it takes about 20, 30 minutes to teach them how to do it. Then you can run an 8-hour session object mapping with them. So you can actually do kind of co-creating, also prioritization. So one thing that we do, so ORCA is an iterative process. We basically go through a discovery round, a requirements round, and a prioritization round, hitting the O, the R, the C, and the A every single time. And so prioritization is a great thing. Like sometimes you're kind of taking in the research, existing screens, user interviews to do that first pass. But then with the prioritization, you can say, like, going back to Edtech, there were a couple attributes that we didn't know what was most important. So we sent out a survey to about 30 or 40 teachers. We got results for about 30 or 40 teachers where they forced ranked. It was like, what information do you want to know about a student? And one of them was, what tier are they? What is their overall time on task? Blah, 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 blah. And time on task was the one that I will never forget, because like for 20 years, this company had been prioritizing that piece of information. Like teachers need to know average time on task for their students. And it was all the way at the bottom. So then we actually, those sticky notes, you can actually order them to kind of like further prototype. And then that can inform how you design your screens, placement on the page, visual prioritization of things. So yeah, big in prioritization. Then the other thing I'll say is, once you've gone through the ORCA process, you haven't actually done any UI yet. You haven't done any flows. You might have figured out what buttons go on what objects, but you haven't done like what happens when somebody clicks that button. You can prototype that. You can prototype your content model. Basically, once you have an object map that's like approved by the entire team, you can translate that into a prototype if you're fast in like an afternoon. Create a clickable prototype that you can test, because it really is that interaction design, that back and forth that's so cost intensive, right? Where you're having to design edge cases, but really just figuring out, are these the right things? Are they connected in a way that makes sense? Is this what you want to do to those things? And is this information the right information? Is this how you want to sort? Is this how you want to filter? Is there any information that's missing? You can actually prototype that. So, which is a beautiful thing. Because you don't want to, like, if the objects are wrong, it's the foundation, right? If the stuff is wrong and it's connected in the wrong way, or there's not certain calls to action there, or some call to action, people are like, I don't know, why do I click that? You don't need to do all of that interaction design around it. So it can save you a lot of time.
Sophia, I'm going to...
Go ahead.
I think Larry and I were jumping in at the same time to say the same thing. I think we should probably wrap this up. Big thanks to you and to the panel. Big thanks to everyone who joined us tonight. Excited to see you, especially with people from around the world and all time zones in the United States. So appreciate that. For some folks, it's getting late, including for Sophia and Gillian, who are on the East Coast.
Gina too. Gina's in New York, and Rick is
right.
across the ocean.
The middle of the night at this point. So
that's really funny.
Oh my goodness. So anyway, thank you to everyone. Just a reminder, join us on Slack, watch our LinkedIn, watch our Twitter feed. We'd love to see you at future events. And I guess that's it. Thanks.
Rock on. Happy OUXing.
Everybody, have a good evening.
Hi, y'all. It was great seeing everybody. Bye.